Today I have the pleasure of welcoming uh, my colleague Jim Reichert, who was an SHC Fellow during the 2021 academic year. Jim teaches modern Japanese literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at Stanford. He has worked a lot on popular culture, mass culture, representations of male-male sexuality, on Japanese silent film, 19th century illustrated books, and a number of other things. Today, we are glad to have Jim back to speak about his latest book, Literature for the Masses, Japanese Period Fiction 1913 to 1941, which was published last year by University of Hawaii Press. Literature for the Masses is the first book in English on a kind of genre of popular stories known in Japan alternately as period fiction or mass literature. And what the book does is cast a light on the kind of cultural, invisible cultural work that these stories are doing, and tries to challenge the conventional wisdom about them that they are, merely a kind of nostalgic entertainment or something anachronistic. It's really a wonderful book, and I've been engrossed in it for the last couple of weeks. If you want to delve deeper than today's conversation, there is a related essay by Jim that was written for our online salon, Arcade, and we have a link to that on the event page for today's event on the SHC website. Let me not delay any longer, and let me invite Jim to start telling us about the book. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you, Roland, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Humanities Center for the support that I received from the center while I was writing this book. It was really essential to the whole process, and it was a wonderful year, even though it was in the middle of COVID. It still was highly productive, and I couldn't have finished the book if I hadn't had that support. Without further ado, I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and I'm going to start my talk. Hopefully everyone can see that. One moment, please, while I organize myself. The book, as Roland mentioned, is titled Literature for the Masses, Japanese Period Fiction, 1913 to 1941. And I want to start at the current moment, because I feel that there are some real resonances between the MAGA movement and this form of entertainment. So in the wake of Donald Trump's reelection, a few things have already become clear. In addition to leveraging frustration with the cost of living and sticky inflation among a majority of voters, his campaign appealed to a highly engaged subset of this group by welding together calls for total disruption of the status quo with vague references to an earlier era of American greatness. Complementing this message was the campaign's effort to exploit the affordances of the modern media ecosystem, particularly influential podcasts that constitute the heart of the so-called manosphere. As people struggle to understand why the strategy met with such electoral success and what it might portend for the future, I offer an example from the first half of the 20th century in Japan that might be illuminating. In the 19 teens, Japan witnessed the emergence of a powerful new narrative form that is the subject of my book, Literature for the Masses. The book looks specifically at the genre known as period fiction or jidai shousetsu. Since 2015, when I began conducting research for this project, I witnessed the power of the MAGA movement's political messaging with its distinctive blend of chaos, nostalgia, and incitement. The circumstances of the past decade or so have thus shaped my understanding of early 20th century Japanese period fiction in a variety of unexpected ways. It might at first seem like a stretch to draw a line between current conditions in the United States and a popular form of narrative entertainment that took off in Japan over 100 years ago. But there are, I contend, meaningful parallels. Period fiction offered readers breathless accounts of pre-modern warrior daring do. Also regularly referred to as mass literature, or taishu bungaku, the tales constituted the first form of written entertainment in Japan that appealed to a mass audience. Composed in simple but vivid prose, They captured the imagination of a newly literate population that was the first generation to benefit from the educational reforms instituted by the Japanese state in the late 19th century. Able to read but thoroughly unmoved by the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the modern Japanese novel, this audience gravitated to a form that energetically reinvented pre-modern vendetta tales and quest narratives in ways that elicited an unending cascade of thrills and chills. Focusing on this electrifying newness, advocates of the form promoted it as a cultural revolution, a timely alternative to the bourgeois navel-gazing of the modern realistic novel that was deemed to be both out of touch and effeminate. In a manner comparable to MAGA rhetoric, period fiction thus forged together the ambience of chaotic disruption, a potent vision of masculinity, and an amorphous evocation of the past to create a new form that catalyzed a powerful emotional response among mass readers. These narratives, I argue, are an early cultural manifestation of an ultra-reactionary form of populism that arose in Japan starting in the late 1920s. Their reach can be attributed to the fact that these colorful stories were a ubiquitous feature in newspapers, magazines, and cheaply produced books, not to mention the source material for countless films, theatrical productions, songs, and radio dramas. The compositions leveraged these high-profile platforms to engage both implicitly and explicitly with other types of literary expression. This engagement often took the form of overt denunciation and differentiation, but it also involved the more subtle process of metabolizing the thematic concerns, the narrative strategies, and sensibilities of its literary and cultural rivals. In short, period fiction was thoroughly integrated into both the modern media ecosystem and the creative sphere of the written arts. Producers and consumers perceive these narratives to be a literary revolution that changed the scale, pace, and pattern of human experience by offering radically new avenues for knowing, and this is important, feeling the Japanese past. And so I think one of the first interventions of this book, and maybe one of the most important, is that it is a sustained look at a genre that was ubiquitous, but has not really been studied in any kind of depth. I have chosen 1913 to 1941 as the start and end points for this study because in addition to corresponding to the heyday of the genre, these years also correlate with the serialization of Nakazato Kaizan's magnum opus, The Great Buddha Pass or The Great Bodhisattva Pass. Considered one of the masterpieces of period fiction, not to mention one of the longest Japanese novels of the modern era, this work is regularly cited as the point of origin of the genre of period fiction. During its extended serialization in multiple venues, the narrative epitomized many constituent features of the genre. For example, it self-consciously promoted itself as an artistic disruption that sought to overthrow the reigning literary conventions of the day. Complementing this insurgent spirit were the aesthetic values of shock and rupture that permeate the narrative, particularly the kinetic sword fight scenes and the ruthless violence of its warrior protagonist. And I have to say that when I read this story, I was shocked by the brutality of the protagonist. Kaizan's narrative also typifies the way that period narratives offered audiences something new through their strategic manipulation of temporality. It established a pattern for how these narratives infused the past with a sense of fervid immediacy as they ostentatiously deviated from an apprehension of time as a neutral dimension through which events unfold in a straightforward chronological order. It thus models for subsequent compositions the way that period fiction combines the dynamism, disruption, and abstraction of modernity with a vision of history that purports to serve as the emotional core of the Japanese identity. Despite its enthusiastic rendition of the days of yore then, The Great Buddha Pass was anything but a cultural anachronism. To the contrary, with this narrative, Kaizan pioneered a new way for audiences to experience the modern through exciting and imaginative reconstructions of the past. And so another important intervention of this book, I believe, is that it offers an extended analysis and discussion of the narrative structure, the literary techniques, and the thematic preoccupations of this genre. It is possible to see links between the Great Buddha Pass and numerous antecedents that flourished in the pre-modern era, such as kabuki history plays, professional storytellers, and illustrated books. But a series of developments in the early 20th century transformed these pre-modern cultural products into something entirely new. One essential factor was the dramatic rise in literacy rates. By the second decade of the 20th century, somewhere between 90 and 95% of the population in Japan had achieved basic literary skills, or literacy skills. Another important development was the steady growth of the Japanese domestic economy, which by the 19-teens has expanded enough that significant segments of the population had achieved a level of basic economic security. This enabled the accrual of disposable income that could be spent on cultural pursuits, notably reading material. These two conditions, along with the importation and development of various technologies, including high-speed, mechanized printing, binding, papermaking, and photocomposition techniques, resulted in the explosive expansion of the commercial printing industry, which encompassed newspapers, magazines, and books. Period fiction emerged out of this environment as a direct result of writers and publishers endeavoring to produce material for a massive audience of new readers. This audience was steeped in the types of pre-modern entertainment, but was not habituated to reading the vernacular, realist, often confessional type of prose fiction that was viewed by the cultural elite as the most legitimate form of modern Japanese literature. Sensing an opportunity, writers and publishers produced prose narratives that strategically reworked familiar elements from older forms, most notably stories about pre-modern fighting men and martial action. They marketed these narratives as a new form of entertainment known as mass literature. Although scholars of modern Japanese literary history acknowledge the popularity of this material, they typically dismiss it as either retrograde content devised to attract not fully modernized consumer subjects, or as a commodity form that trades in trite stereotypes of the Japanese past. My project attempts to complicate this conventional assessment. Specifically, I argue that period fiction, despite its seeming affinity with pre-modern types of entertainment, constitutes a radically new approach toward literature and culture. This inventiveness is initially difficult to recognize because period fiction narratives do not resemble the type of rarefied literary experimentation that is often associated with artistic revolution. Other obstacles to perceiving its groundbreaking newness include the historical setting of the works, their unabashed celebration of a highly idealized representation of masculinity and martial prowess, and the fact that they amount to a commodity form. But closer examination of period fiction reveals suggestive parallels with contemporaneous efforts to reimagine the boundaries of literary expression, such as the historical avant-garde, the elite I-novel, and proletarian fiction. And these are the three movements that are thought to dominate Japan in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century. Much like these contemporaneous literary movements, the form, content, and raison d'etre of mass literature were all profoundly impacted by the destabilizing conditions of modernity. And not surprisingly, its response to this new environment echoed the ways that other leading literary movements reacted. And so a third important intervention of this book, I think, is that it considers mass literature in conversation with other forms of literature that were prevalent at the time. I'm trying to argue against this idea that all of these forms are existing in separate silos and they're not connected, but they're all very much intertwined with each other. And this idea that mass literature is in conversation with them at all is pretty new. I'll start by addressing the many resonances between mass literature and avant-garde modernism. Both movements, for example, actively sought to translate the chaos and energy of the modern environment into a new form of cultural expression. In the case of mass literature, this was achieved through its nonstop action, its peripatetic characters, and its shocking violence. The revolutionary zeal of the movement also mirrors the insurgent energy of the avant-garde. Another important parallel resides in the way that both movements commit totally to the project of denaturalizing narrative. For mass literature, this manifests itself in how the narratives abandoned any pretense of historical accuracy. period fiction narratives do not claim to represent the past as it was. Rather, they offer themselves as an overt mediating mechanism that transforms the past into something that is emotionally stimulating for consumers in the present. In other words, they ostentatiously convert the past into a modern media spectacle. As the movement matured, this same denaturalizing project was transferred to the genre itself. Depending on the context, artists could deliberately manipulate the increasingly standardized features of the genre to achieve a variety of second-order aesthetic and literary effects. With its focus on action and adventure, period fiction at first seems to depart radically from the conventions of the elite I-novel, which is a form of prose narrative in which the narrator is equated with the author, and the content of the narratives are confessional narrative in nature, where the narrative discloses some shameful or shocking secret about the protagonist. So, although these fighting stories seem like they have nothing to do with these tales of bourgeois shame, I think the overlaps are meaningful, and principal among them is the central conceit of both movements that narrative serves as a direct, personalized channel of communication between writers and their audience. In the case of mass literature, this mediation was thought to work in both directions. The authors not only claimed that their tales spoke directly to the mass audience, but also perceived their compositions to be materializations of an aesthetic sensibility that derived directly from the same audience. The representational operations of these compositions function primarily as a strategy of mediation. That is, through their interposition, these narratives bridge the gap not just between author and audience, but also between literature and the masses, as well as between the past and the present. The other important way that mass literature pairs with the I-novel is the focus on the evocation of emotion. Barbara Mito-Reed elucidates that the I-novel sought to dissolve the temporal gap between the time of narration and story time. This technique, she argues, heightens the sense of immediacy and thus magnifies the impact of the feelings depicted in the narrative. Although mass literature delinks this technique from the trope of personal confession, it accomplishes something similar through its mode of representing history. By absorbing the past into the narrating present, the genre diminishes the historiographical and intellectual meaning of narrative in favor of foregrounding the emotional wallop delivered by the breathless account of the adventures of its dynamic characters. It is this sense of proximity and approachability of mass period narratives that made their emotional affect such a powerful touchstone for consumers overwhelmed by the dislocations of the modern world. The parallels between mass literature and proletarian literature were widely recognized during the 1920s. This awareness is not surprising, given that the movements shared multiple features. For one, both were at the forefront of efforts to maximize the communication potential of Japan's new media environment. These efforts were motivated by their shared desire to reach a new audience of readers. Indeed, both movements were structured around the principle of reception, as indicated by their popular designations: proletarian literature, or literature for the proletariat, and mass literature, or literature for the masses. Although they imagined their target audiences differently, proletarian writers viewed them as part of an exploited social and economic underclass, whereas mass writers saw them as a group defined by their cultural tastes. The two movements shared the view that their target audience constituted the beating heart of Japanese society. But as proletarian literature struggled to reach any kind of audience and transform the worldview of its readers and inculcate in them a transnational proletarian identity, it was eclipsed in the popular imagination by mass literature, which succeeded in exploiting the affordances of narrative media in a way that opened stimulating new avenues for its audience to relate to Japanese history and national identity. During the so-called massification debate of 1928, the nature of the relationship between proletarian literature and mass literature became the source of many acrimonious exchanges among leftist activists. This clash involved two factions of the Marxist movement. One faction consisted of what I'll call hardliners, who argued for ideological purity in all propaganda material. The other of activists who believed that incorporation of elements from popular culture would make narratives more appealing to the masses and therefore more effective. Arguing on behalf of the latter position, a well-known Marxist activist and theorist, Hayashi Fusao, encouraged his fellow Japanese Marxists to look to mass literature writers like Nakazato Kaizan, the author of The Great Buddha Pass, for inspiration. And here I quote, he stated, "Mass literature must be interesting to attract mass audiences. It must contain many playful elements. It must be bursting with story, events, wild flights of fancy, humor, satire, healthy desire, and exhilarating heroism." End of quote. Here, Hayashi provides a catalog of narrative elements that contribute to the appeal of mass literature. If only proletarian writers could incorporate some of these ingredients into their works, he urged, they might have a chance of sharing their ideological agenda with the masses and thus spur the lumpen proletariat into political action. Significantly, Hayashi frames these elements of mass narrative in highly emotive terms: the playfulness, the wild flights of fancy, the exhilarating heroism, the healthy desire, all speak to a literary form that elicits an elemental, affective response from its audience. This emotional appeal corresponds to what Janice Radway refers to as the transitivity of mass books, by which she means the ability of certain forms of written entertainment to function as a utilitarian tool to achieve specific goals. And here I quote her, "In many cases, readers of cheap books aimed simply to experience pleasure in its manifold forms, accompanied by diverse affective and somatic effects. Whether cheap books were to produce the skin-crawling sensation of fear, the upwelling tears of pathos, the erotic excitements of romance, or the bated breath of suspense, they were picked up precisely because they were successful in moving the body and provoking emotions." End of quote. According to Radway, the increasing sophistication of writers, publishers, and booksellers during the first decades of the 20th century to exploit this transitive function of narrative revealed the extent to which capitalist incentives had completely overrun the book trade. Radway's insight thus illuminates another critical dimension of mass literature's adaptation to the new media environment of the early 20th century. Mass literature responded to the consumerist logic of the era in ways that other literary movements could only aspire to. In the US and Japan, this consumerist logic reoriented the production of literature, shifting the focus of writers and publishers to the potential uses, expectations, and desires of the reader. Indeed, mass literature epitomizes this reader-focused orientation. Commentary on how the genre caters to the sensibility of the masses permeates discourse about the movement. Advocates of mass literature regularly cite their audience as the chief inspiration behind their efforts. Less openly acknowledged, at least by advocates of the movement at the time, yet equally relevant is the extent to which this reader-focused orientation enhanced the commodification of mass literature. The narratives were deliberately written in a manner that appealed to a mass audience and thus stimulated the sales of printed matter and other forms of period entertainment. Period fiction sold, in other words, precisely because it offered a concrete use value to its consumers. On one level, this use value was directly related to the thrills, the chills, the gasps, and the sighs of the eventful action-packed narratives provided in spades. Radway emphasizes that in addition to eliciting effective and somatic responses, commercial literature promises another important value to its audience: the consolidation of a social identity. In the case of Japanese mass literature, this social identity occupied a space at the intersection of class and nation. These narratives managed to link together a non-elite cultural sensibility and an emotion-laden reproduction of the Japanese past. Mass literature thus participated in a process through which class antagonism and ethno-nationalism became expressed through a cultural affinity for a vividly reimagined vision of Japanese history. This leads me to another central thread of my argument, which revolves around the issue of ideology. Earlier, I declared that period fiction thought of itself as a literary insurrection, or presented itself as a literary insurrection. I did this to underscore that despite its historical content, mass literature did not constitute an expression of conservatism in the conventional sense, and I think this is important. That is, it does not advocate a return to the past. Rather, it conceives itself as a disruptive movement that aspires to overthrow the existing literary hierarchy and replace it with a new set of aesthetic and cultural values. This sentiment is exemplified by Mikami Otokichi, who was a popular period fiction author and a self-proclaimed fascist. And he confidently asserts, here I quote, "If I'm allowed to make a prediction, I foresee that today's artistic novel will ossify into a specialized form like the haiku, allowing mass literature one day to monopolize the world of letters," end of quote. Animating this insurrectionary agenda is a close affiliation with the populist people's art movement that was globally prevalent at the time. With their regular invocations of the people, the populist rhetoric surrounding period fiction movement also echoes contemporaneous reactionary ideological and political formations, variously known in Japan as fascism, Japanism, ultranationalism, and imperialism. The genre links with this political ideology through the way that it serves as a literary insurgency that explicitly reformulates the Japanese past as something electrifyingly new. That is, period fiction's mix of revolutionary impulses, reliance on new techniques and technologies, prioritization of feelings over facts, hazy invocations of authentic Japaneseness, commitment to the cathartic value of destructive violence, and laser-like focus on the so-called masses conspicuously mirror linchpins of early 20th century ultra-reactionary thought. This is not to suggest that any of the texts under consideration in my book put forward a unified or systematic expression of this ideology, much less that the literary movement as a whole was in lockstep with it. Rather, the cultural work of these narratives was more complicated. In short, I argue that period fiction simultaneously operated as a commodity form, a new type of entertainment media, a literary insurrection, and a strategically manipulated reification of Japanese identity. This mix generated a frisson of excitement that attracted huge audiences and laid the foundations for a potential but never clearly realized ideological power. The project thus uses period fiction to explore the knotty relationship that links but does not conflate populism, reactionism, and capitalism. And so I think another important point that I'm trying to make in this book is that there's a tendency to view authoritarianism and reactionary thought in Japan as a 100% top-down movement. And I think that by looking at period fiction, we can see how in the popular discourse and popular forms of entertainment, there were sentiments, narrative forms, discourses that were activating and intensifying this same kind of populist ethos. So it's not just top-down, it's happening everywhere. So the book is divided into two parts. The three chapters that comprise part one focus on well-known examples of period fiction, all of which exhibit the typical features of the genre: a solitary and charismatic hero, an eventful plot, and an endless cascade of thrilling sword fights. Chapters 1 through 3 thus explore how these narratives interact with the wider conditions of Japanese modernity, particularly the emergence of new media ecosystems that facilitated the production, transmission, and consumption of culture, entertainment, and ideology. And the titles of the works that I study in these first three chapters are The Great Budapest, which is the first chapter, a vendetta tale called The Transformation of Yukinojō, and then Miyamoto Musashi. And Miyamoto Musashi is an important text because it is arguably the best-selling and most popular novel published in Japan in the 20th century. Part two of the book also consists of three chapters. These chapters address works that, in terms of mass popularity, historical subject matter, and widespread cultural influence, correspond to the conventional definition of period fiction, but typically are not categorized as such. The works are Shimazaki Toson's Before the Dawn, which is an example. I keep on using the term period fiction, and that's because it is distinguished from another genre called historical fiction, or rekishi shosetsu, which I can talk about in Q&A. But Before the Dawn is seen as the most important example of historical fiction published in the beginning of the 20th century. And then another title in the second half is Tanizaki Junichiro's The Secret History of the Lord of Musashi, which is a parody of period fiction. And then the last title is Okubo Yasuo's 1938 translation of Gone with the Wind. And Gone with the Wind is the other most popular book published in the 20th century of Japan. So I think one of the nice things about the project is I found a way to talk about these two mega bestsellers of the 20th century in Japan together in a way that I think makes a lot of sense. Part two thus explores how an array of cultural producers, not directly associated with the movement of period fiction, actively engaged with the communication strategies pioneered by mass literature writers to imbue their representations of the past with a sense of immediacy, accessibility, and urgency. As I said at the outset of this talk, I believe that the ideologically loaded frisson of excitement generated by all of these materials aligns meaningfully with the conditions of our own political moment. Let me first emphasize that I clearly recognize that Japan of the 1920s and the 1930s differs from the United States today. Moreover, I'm aware of the space separating creative fiction from political propaganda, but I submit that the atmospherics of the two phenomena are comparable. Take, for example, the slogan, "Make America Great Again." In the manner comparable to the Japanese past proffered by period fiction narratives, this evocation of an earlier era of the United States is bereft of any empirical foundation. But this vagueness is precisely what makes it so powerful. Its malleability enables it to function as the basis of a dynamic storyverse that stokes resentment against elite institutions, conveys a sense of shared values, and excites powerful emotions, and offers, and I think this is really crucial, offers non-stop drama that overwhelms us. Taken to its extreme, we know this story verse can excite an event like the insurrection of January 6, 2021, or the conditions unfolding today in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this is why these kind of movements cannot be dismissed and need to be understood. Although early 20th century Japanese period fiction is not a perfect analogy, it is a concrete historical precedent of a similar type of cultural phenomenon. Both approaches towards storytelling convey a sense of urgency, a blatant disregard for facts, an easy command of new media, and an in-your-face exuberance. And again, I think that's really important for both movements. In both contexts, an imaginary past becomes a space ripe for cultural insurrection. It is my hope that a detailed study of Japanese mass literature will offer some insights into the strategies and techniques through which this type of cultural narrative can bewitch its audience. We know how this ended for Japan in the first half of the 20th century. Examination of popular period fiction shows that the insurrectionary spirit of the genre was symptomatic of the wider political and social transition to a form of ultranationalism that elevated Japanese identity to the apex of a high-stakes emotional spectacle. Given that we are in the middle of the fight and thus lack critical distance, it is harder to determine at this moment the lasting impact of the MAGA storyverse on the cultural and politics of the United States. Only time will tell. Thank you.
Bravo, Jim. Thank you so much. To our audience, before we are about to turn to conversation, but before we do that, let me just remind you that if you want to submit a question to Jim, you may use the Q&A function in Zoom, and the question will come to us, and we will try to pass it on to Jim in the 45 minutes or so that we have left. Let me also, while you're doing that, let me also mention that this event is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. Jim, let me begin with a very general kind of question. I'm sure I'm not the only one listening who is intrigued about this genre of fiction and would love to hear more about it in terms of style and content and form. Could you give us a little more insight into that aspect of it?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So as I mentioned, the content, so I think it has some important component features. I think one, as I mentioned, is that these stories focus invariably on a solitary, charismatic, highly potent swordsman. And these fighters typically hail from the lower echelons of the samurai class, or in some cases, they're not even samurai. And so there's always, an element of kind of built into the story because of these lower echelon fighter heroes who are always fighting corrupt establishments and corrupt elites who are the adversaries or the enemies in these stories. There's sort of built into them a kind of class identity and a focus on an idealization of a lower class hero. The stories are also, so they are, I think, an important part of the story is that they are, I kept on talking about how they are kind of blatantly ahistorical. And so they have a, I guess the best way I could describe it is they convey a historical vibe. So they'll throw out references to certain fighting techniques or material objects from that time or historical figures from that time or historical events from the period. But in other ways, they're completely ahistorical. The way this characters speak and the way the narrative is written is in a very legible and easy to understand modern form of Japanese. The characters often express conceptions of self that are very modern. And so this story kind of erases the space separating the past from the present, so it makes it really accessible and seemingly, yeah, it's accessible to a modern audience. The stories, and then I think another feature of the stories is that they overlay all of the action with emotion. So there's a lot of focus on either the protagonist's rage or in many cases, the protagonist's bloodlust, fear, or the fear of his victims. And so they contain, the stories contain these like emotional high points that are typically intertwined with scenes of violence. And the violence is always idealized. That can often be quite gruesome, but it is glorified in lots of ways. And it's often seen as resolving a problem. So I guess the other feature of these narratives is that they always privilege action over thought.
Mm, mm.
And so it's always better to do something than to think about something, which is important. So those I think are I don't know. I'm sure there are other things and I'm happy to talk more about the stories.
I think in a few minutes I want to come back to the way that they're not historical. But before we do that, let me ask you also something I wondered about at the beginning of the talk was the terminology that you're using is sort of bifurcated into period fiction and mass literature. Could you explain the relation between the two terms as they work for you?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So that is an idea I really develop throughout the book. And so I guess I'll start out by saying that there were lots of forms of new narrative that were emerging in the beginning of the 20th century in Japan. And and some of them were quite popular and widely read. So there are melodramatic narratives with domestic settings. There's detective fiction. Um, there's fantasy and things like that. But it's only this one genre of stories set in the past that was also referred to as mass literature. So there was something in the ether at that time where people sensed that this is the one form of literature that is breaking through to a mass audience, that these other forms that were also quite popular didn't have the same juice, I guess is what you could say. And so it's referred to as both mass literature and period fiction. And what I'm sort of trying to tease out with that is I want to, so as Roland mentioned when he introduced the book, and as I talked about a little bit at the beginning of my talk, there is a tendency to kind of dismiss this material, say, oh yeah, it was popular, but it just wasn't a holdover from the past. It was anachronistic. And so I want to think of it. So I'm using these terms of period fiction, which I'm thinking of as a genre, and mass literature, which I'm thinking has more kind of nuances of media.
Mm,
And so the way that people typically understand this is they say, oh, what's modern about, if there's anything is modern about this, is that these materials appeared in newspapers or they appeared in mass magazines, which were new forms of media.
mm,
And it's the media itself, it's the magazine or the newspaper that's the modern thing, and the stories are just kind of inert content that they're using to fill that space, and it could be anything. And so I'm trying to sort of imbue this material, saying that because it was sort of understood in both these ways, both as a genre with specific characteristics, but also as a form called mass literature, that sort of the defining feature of it is that it's kind of reaching and connecting with the masses. And so I'm trying to argue that there's actually something about these narratives themselves that is central to kind of this transformation in reading practices at the time. It's, these newspapers existed, but lots of people weren't reading them until they started serializing these narratives. So I feel like it's actually the narrative that is the catalyst for this new pattern of reading. And it's kind of the techniques of the narrative or the content of the narrative and the atmosphere of the narrative that has the transformative power that can activate, a social identity and things like that.
So I think I get it. So the analytical lenses here are sort of alternately through genre and through sort of media,
Yeah.
and the same material could be looked at through either or both, and you're sort of moving between them in the course of the book.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Good. How much do we know about the authors of these fictions? You mentioned a
Oh,
couple of names, but sort of as a class, as an occupation, as a, sort of who are they and where do they come from?
so they so these authors so what is happening in Japan and probably the rest of the world at this time is that as popular culture and these newspapers, publishing, commercial publishing are really ramping up, it becomes an opportunity. So up until this point, authors could support themselves as professional authors, um, but they couldn't become rich. But at this point, the financial rewards are significant enough that authors can actually become quite wealthy and they can also become kind of celebrity figures in
Mhm.
a way that was, at least at the scale, was not as possible before. So yeah, so we do know a lot about these authors because not only were they writing, but they were giving interviews and they were cultural spokespeople. And during the war, they were dispatched out to the front to write about the conflict, and particularly in China. Um, and so they had very public personas and were well known. Um, one of so Yoshikawa Eiji, the author of Miyamoto Musashi, came from a very poor family. He got started as a writer. He submitted material to a writing contest, and then suddenly was made the face of a very important mass journal, and he was kind of became the face of the mass literature movement for the 1930s, and was extremely popular. Um, I guess another thing I would mention is that these authors tend to align themselves with the more reactionary movements of the time. So as I mentioned, um, the author of Yukinojō, the Transformation of Yukinojō, proclaimed himself as a fascist. Yoshikawa Eiji was involved in a fascist literary group that was quite influential. So they did align themselves with the political currents of the time in very public ways. Um, and they were effective spokespeople because people read their material, they read about them in newspapers, they were interested in their stories, and they were popular figures in and of themselves.
And I'm sure some of us are also curious about the readers of these stories and especially in terms of class and gender. You had a couple of illustrations in the talk of women poring over something, and it made me think: is that part of the story, or is that what can you tell us about the readers?
Yeah, so there is a lot of so the simple way to know the literacy rates is that the Department of War, so just like the United States now, the Department of War in Japan uh, gave so there was a universal conscription, and so um, lots of men were, I mean, there were ways to get out of it, but lots of men were conscripted in the army, and they were given a literacy test when they entered, and so that forms this amazing data source for literacy rates, and so so there is quite an accurate way of assessing the really rapid increase in literacy rates that occurs in the late 19th and the first decade of the 20th century based on these exam. Sorry, I don't know how to turn that off. So and then there are also lots of surveys of readers. So these magazines and newspapers were curious about, I mean, they wanted to find out what their audiences liked. So they put out surveys and tried to figure out who was purchasing the material, what were they reading, what did they like. And so these surveys are another source of information. And then you have in Japan, just like you have in other parts of the world, you have a media studies academic discipline that is arising. And so they're doing all kinds of exploration and examination study of reading practices at the time. And then the state is doing a lot of exploration. So there is a decent data set to work from to figure out who's reading what. And the biggest bump in readership that corresponds to the rise of this genre is young men with limited education from the countryside. So that seems to be the reading audience that was activated. But these materials were so popular that that wasn't just the only audience that was reading them. Everybody was reading them. So lots of women were reading them as well. And you see that, for example, in Miyamoto Musashi, there are lots of strategies in the narrative that are targeting a female audience. So there's a heroine who is quite central to the story, and she kind of ties in with tropes of romantic fiction at the time. So authors are trying to come up with strategies for appealing to as many different categories of readers as they can, because they want to reach as many people as they can, to sell the most copies, and to get the most readers. So yeah, so men and women are definitely reading these materials.
Good. Thank you. We have three questions from the audience that all have to do with different versions of about the relation of this corpus to other kinds of Japanese literature. So let me pose these three questions, and I'll try to put them in sort of chronological order. How does the period fiction and other genres of Japanese literature in the early 20th century, in other words, I assume what you're studying, how does it influence post-World War II Japanese literature?
So I talk about that in the conclusion of my book. So period fiction is still very I mean, if you have lived in Japan, or it's still very popular. And there are period films, there is period fiction, there are television shows that have period content, period theme content. So it is something that continues to resonate today in Japan. But my argument is that, and the argument I try to make in the conclusion of my book, is that it hits differently in the post-war period. And so I make this distinction, I touched on it in my talk, a kind of insurrectionary versus conservative, where conservatism is about, oh, there's this important thing in the past and we need to maintain that, and maybe even go back to it. And period fiction isn't about that. It's not about going back. It's about going forward. The past is kind of a launch pad to sort of blow up the present and move on to something new. And so the argument I make is that after the war, after the occupation, that period fiction becomes more conventionally conservative, and it is far less insurrectionary and disruptive. And it's almost impossible for people who are familiar with the way that it signals in a post-war context, which is almost all of us. It's kind of hard to uncover and excavate that pre-war sensibility, because because actually a lot of the texts, and this is Miyamoto Musashi is again a good example. A lot of the texts that were popular before the war are continuing to be popular after the war, but I think they resonate differently. And Miyamoto Musashi is a good example because Yoshikawa Eiji was actually investigated as a war criminal after the war because of his actions during the conflict, and he wasn't convicted. But then he revised Miyamoto Musashi, wrote a new introduction saying, well, what this story really is about, not what I said it was before about sort of overcoming the problems of the modern and sort of going back to this more sort of violent, active, action focused mentality of the past that can then allow us to um, move beyond. He talks about people sleepwalking into the modern and how this story is going to wake them up and keep them from doing that. After the war, he says, well, what we realize is that these values of liberty and freedom, they always existed in Japan, and we just need to sort of go back and find them and cultivate them. And that's what's valuable about this story. And he was violent, but he didn't really want to be violent. That was his tragedy. So he puts a very different spin on it.
In what you just said, Jim, you said a couple of sentences that anticipate the next question from the audience, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it's an important one, especially around a word that you and both the questioner use, resonance, emotional resonance. So the questioner says, how do the emotional resonance and the politics of period fiction compare to those in popular contemporary representations of samurai, such as the recent Shogun series on Netflix? You alluded to this briefly, but maybe we could invite you to say a little more.
Yeah, so again, I think that and so Shogun is yeah, that was a phenomenon just recently. A couple things I would say is again, so there's plenty of violence in Shogun, but when you read material about that show. For example, they make a big point of how the characters are trying to speak in a classical form of Japanese and how difficult that was for the actors, even the Japanese native speakers. And so there is an effort. I mean, it's not perfect, but there's an effort to be historically accurate. And so again, I think that is a really important feature of this pre-war period fiction is that it's not claiming to be historically accurate. It doesn't try to be historically accurate. And actually among the fan base, you'll have these kind of nitpicking readers who will say, oh, this couldn't have possibly happened, in some, because a lot of these stories would be published and then there would be sections in the magazine that would be letters from readers or
Uh,
readers would write directly to the author and they would say, oh, this isn't, you represented something inaccurately. And then you would just like in sort of comment sections that you'd have all these people jump on that and say, this is so stupid. This person doesn't get it. That's not the point. This is about, and this one person even says really specifically, I don't care if it's historically accurate. I care about how it makes me feel. It's exciting to me and I love it. And this stupid person doesn't get it and they shouldn't be reading this. So I feel like I mean, I'm sure a expert on late medieval, early modern Japan could look at the production of Shogun and say, oh, this isn't accurate, this isn't accurate. But they are trying, they're making an effort to be historically accurate, and it's kind of well publicized. And I think that is a really important distinction.
Good, thank you. And here's the third comparative question. Have any of these stories worked their way into modern kabuki plays?
Oh my God. Probably. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that is my accurate, honest answer. So Miyamoto Musashi again is omnipresent. There were lots of theatrical productions before the war, after the war. There have been untold countless film adaptations. There have been television shows. There is animation. There is comics. It's everywhere. I would not be surprised if there is some kabuki troupe that has tried to give their take on the story, but I don't know about it.
Mhm. In the middle of the talk, you mentioned a kind of parallel genre of what you call historical fiction. Could you sketch the relation between the corpus you're describing and this other kind of fiction?
So historical fiction actually emerged earlier than period fiction. So period fiction is very much a product of the early 20th century, and
Mhm.
historical fiction emerged at the very end of the 19th century. And historical fiction is very much an elite form of cultural production. The authors who produce it often are very high status. So the really important author who is kind of thought of as the father of modern historical fiction is Moryogai, who's one of the most important writers to emerge in Japan in the late 19th century. And he really made a point of trying to be historically accurate, trying to ensure that no element of modern psychology was exhibited by these characters. And he did his best to try as well as he could to reproduce what he thought would be the environment, the motivations behind the action of these characters. And so this close connection with academic history is really important to historical fiction. It appeals to a much narrower, more so the kind of nitpicky reader who is furious with period fiction, they would love historical fiction because it's sort of doing exactly what they want. And the text that I focus on is Before the Dawn, which is written by Shimazaki Toson, who is another incredibly influential and prestigious writer from the late 19th and early 20th century. And near the end of his career, he turns toward writing historical fiction. And again, he talks about in endless detail in essays, in newspaper articles, how he used documents from the past and that he tried to make this as accurate as possible and tried to offer readers a model for what he said historical fiction should be. And so he's kind of writing against period fiction. But the point I make in my chapter is that he's also adopting all kinds of strategies from period fiction. And I don't think it's a coincidence that because he adopts all these strategies, that actually Before the Dawn is the one example of historical fiction that was truly popular because he does kind of mine the genre. Even though he's saying I'm different from that, this narrative is different from that, and he kind of very ostentatiously and explicitly differentiates it from period fiction. He's borrowing, I think, techniques.
And would it be accurate to say that that historical fiction is not, it lacks the kind of political valence of trying to use the past as a springboard into an imagined future?
Yes, actually the argument I make in my reading of Before the Dawn, this example of historical fiction that I look at in my book, is that is the strategy that he plugs into. And
Mhm.
so it becomes this view of the Meiji Restoration as a possibility for he presents modernity as it has materialized in Japan as a corrupt system, and that Japan took a wrong turn at the Meiji Restoration, and they should have followed a course that was more disruptive and revolutionary, and that's why Japan is in the mess that it's in.
Okay. Here's another question. The questioner writes, your book is terrific. My short review will appear in Choice magazine soon. Well, we're glad to hear that.
Yes.
Can you say that Tanazaki's The Secret History of the Lord of Musashi reworks period fiction into high literature?
Okay, so let me first give you a brief. So Tanizaki Junichiro is another really central writer of 20th century in Japan. I encourage everyone out there to read something by Tanizaki. He's just a wonderful, wonderful writer. Maybe my favorite author. He does, he has a phase in his career where he dabbles in period fiction. And probably the most sensational example of that is The Secret History of the Lord of Musashi, which in typical Tanizaki fashion is about a warlord who has a fetish with decapitation. And he becomes upset. He has a fantasy of becoming a decapitated head and being lovingly sort of attended to by a beautiful woman who cleans up at the decapitated head and also makes fun of it because he's a masochist. And so the story is a parody of that. I guess it's much more knowing, I would say. It's a very self-aware take on period fiction. And actually, I think what is happening in that story is that so the protagonist of of the tale becomes obsessed with these decapitated heads, and he sort of organizes his whole life around trying to reproduce this experience he has when he's a teenage boy, where he sneaks into this room where all these beautiful women, which was, well, not necessarily beautiful women, but women in these castles when they were besieged would, so a practice in samurai warfare was that you would take the heads of the people that you had killed. And so then these women in the castle would tend to these heads and try to treat them respectfully. And so this kid walks in there and sees it, and he's really turned on by it. And that becomes the source of this fantasy that I want to be one of those heads and have one of these beautiful women take care of me. And so then he tries to reproduce that in all kinds of increasingly theatrical ways. And so the argument I make is that actually the narrator of this story is this antiquarian who claims to have discovered these documents that reveal this secret story. And so he's like sort of uncovering this dark, perverted history of Japan's past. And I say that the protagonist's obsession with these heads is actually an allegory for the narrator's obsession with this character, and that they're both trying to mine the past, the warrior, his own personal past, and then the narrator, this kind of sensational past, to assuage anxieties of the present. And specifically, this story was written in the 1930s when Japan is embarking on its military conquest of East Asia. And it's a period of kind of a dark period of anxiety. And I'm saying that this kind of gruesome fantasy is a strategy for coping with this anxious moment. So yeah, I think it's high literature. I think he takes the genre and does something quite complex and rich and self-aware with it.
Mm-hmm. Let me just for a moment turn to the actual writing of this book and ask you if you could tell us something about the challenges of working on a body of writing that is as neglected as this has been. Uh, at what moments did you feel, that you were sort of bringing insight to something that about which there apparently is very little written?
Well, so I guess on the one hand, that made it easier because I felt like, oh, I'm not just offering some nuanced commentary on something that dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of other people, which is important too. And I've done plenty of that in my career, but it felt like, oh, I'm doing something a little bit new, which I thought actually animated me and kept me moving forward. I mean, the material is fun. It's well written. It's energizing. I mean, maybe not in always the healthiest ways, but it is captivating. So going back to the text again and again and again was not a chore. I mean, I have to say, um, the most challenging text was the historical fiction text, which was kind of intentionally written in a boring way because he's trying to differentiate. He's saying, "Oh, I'm being so accurate and so scholarly that I'm not going to engage in all of the sensationalism." So it is a kind of boring text, and so
Mm-hmm.
that was the hardest one to go back to again and again and again and again. So there was that. So, but the other material is it's always trying to grab you, and so I was grabbed, and I didn't mind jumping back into it. So in that sense, I found the materials actually um, they encouraged me, and they were a pleasure to work with. So that made it easier. And yeah, I think the thought that I was maybe offering insights into this, because the other thing is that everyone knows that this material was everywhere. Everyone reads it. Anyone who's been to Japan has encountered it. It's everywhere all the time, and yet there hasn't been that much written about it. So I felt like, oh, it's kind of interesting. There's this huge thing that is so ubiquitous that it's like easy. It's on the one hand, it's easy to ignore, but on the other hand, it's a source of a lot of rich insights, I thought. And there's so much more to say about period fiction for yeah, it's just the beginning. I just scratched the surface.
When you were a fellow at the Humanities Center in 2020 to 2021, it was, as you said earlier, We were in the pandemic. The events of January 6th, 2021 took place while you were a fellow. Was there a moment then or at another time when it occurred to you that you were writing in some indirect way about the present?
I felt like that from especially I felt like that very early, especially when I was reading The Great Buddha Pass. I talked about that. So that's seen as the beginning of the genre. And I mentioned briefly that it was kind of shocking to me when I first read it. And one of the things that's shocking about that story is that the protagonist is so dark and so nihilistic. Um, I mean, he just eventually morphs into this killing machine where he just says, I want to kill everybody. I want to kill anybody I see. I don't care if they're adults or children or men or women or old people. I just want to kill people. I just want blood. And he says, I'm not even human anymore. I'm a monster. Um, and that kind of absolute nihilism, that commitment to kind of thoughtless violence and then the other, so I mentioned the Secret History of the Lord of Musashi. I've said that was a very self-aware text. I also feel like The Great Buddha Pass is a very self-aware text as well. And so there's lots of kind of meta commentary where characters will witness this protagonist engaging in super violent behavior, and they'll say, oh, I wanted to say something, but I was so entranced by what he was doing. It was so exciting, and and now I feel really dirty and bad that I didn't do anything. And I think they're kind of stand-ins for the readers who are reading this stuff and really interested in it and kind of sickly stimulated by it, but also like horrified by it. And so I think it's very self-aware of this kind of the appeal of this nihilistic violence, but also the costs of it. And so it was, at least for me, it was pretty easy to say, I mean, it feels very familiar. I mean, it felt like an incredibly modern way of looking at the world, both the kind of surface level, let's just blow the whole thing up and kill everybody, and also like, oh, this is really cool and exciting, but it's also really scary and dehumanizing. And so, yeah, it kind of started there. And then all the other material, I felt like was doing some variation of that.
Hmm. Hmm. Question from the audience. Are there 20th century uh, or maybe 21st century comparable forms of American mass literature leading up to our current MAGA period?
So, I mean, I'm not a media.
Obviously, it's not your field, but yeah.
I mean, so I was talking with someone just a little bit ago, and they said, yeah, there was sort of a variation of this question, and they were saying, oh, like, what kind of films do you think are the modern equivalents? What's the form of entertainment that is the equivalent of this? And I would say I don't think it's film, I don't think it's literature, I think it's short form, I think it's TikTok, I think it's Instagram, I think it's Reels. I think that's probably where most things are happening, actually, or a lot is happening. And that I think that is the form that is maybe provides the best window into our moment.
Hmm. Do those kinds of materials have the feature of that you're highlighting here, which is leveraging the past to send us into a certain future?
That I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, well, except Make America Great. I mean, I feel like that there's something built into MAGA that is doing that. So I guess any sort of MAGA themed reel or TikTok probably is, I mean, it's sort of the foundational logic of it that then you can take in all kinds of directions. Maybe, I mean, here I'm just spitballing, but
Here's a question that just came in, and let me ask you this. What would Kurosawa think of this?
so I do briefly talk about Kurosawa a little bit in my conclusion. So as I said, um, period entertainment is really a central part of the entertainment industry after the war too. And I think Kurosawa is at the center of that in sort of Jidaigeki films, these films set in the past. He's such an important artist and took the form in new directions. But again, I would say so Seven Samurai, maybe one of his more famous period films. I feel like so that story is about a group of samurai who are hired by a village to protect them from a roaming band of renegades. And the end of the story is that after the samurai have heroically defended the village, um, they're kind of let go. The village gets back to its life, and the surviving samurai go off. And I read that as, uh, I mean, it's kind of a stretch, but I read that as this idea that the military, it's a sort of an allegory that the military is controlled by the civilians, that, the important people, I mean, in the film, the important people are the warriors, but in the world of that story, it's the villagers who are hiring. They're just hiring these guys to protect them, and then once they've done their job, they don't need them anymore. And so it's kind of the yeah. I think so. I think the story is advocating for a vision of the military that's not like, oh, these guys are great. Look at how many people they killed, but that they help these people out, and then when their job is done, they move on, which I think is a very different mindset than, say, for example, the Great Budapest, where this guy's never moving on. He's just, you know, he kills your grandfather, and then he just wants to kill you.
Mhm.
And so he's not going anywhere.
Yeah. What are you going to work on next?
Oh. I don't know. Actually, I think I want to try translating something. I've never done that before, and so I would be curious to A, see if I'm any good at it, and B, I just was reading a short translation of a story called Yellow Rose, and it has a nice little introduction, and it makes this work of schoolgirl fiction accessible to a non-Japanese speaking audience. I thought, oh, that's a really valuable contribution to produce something like that. So yeah, I think at least short term, I would like to see if I could translate something.
Mhm. I have to say, from the standpoint of the Stanford Humanities Center, it's so gratifying to hear about this book after, it was only a few years ago you were among us as a fellow, and we heard quite a bit about it while it was in progress. And then to see it appear and generate this very positive reaction and bring attention to this ubiquitous but critically neglected body of work, I think is so important. And it's so gratifying for us to have played a small role in enabling this. So I often ask this at the end of the events in this series. Um, what was the environment? Of course, we were in the pandemic, but so a lot of things were online. What was the environment of the center like for you in the origin of this book and the development of it in that period 2020 to 2021?
So it
How did the center benefit you, and what how did it influence the book?
it was huge. So it was I wrote. So I was at the writing stage more than the research stage.
Mhm.
But as you know, when you're writing, you're still working things. I mean, your writing is about working ideas out, and so much of the construction of the argument was happening during the writing process. So it was essential. And it was during COVID, but we had a group that met online every week, or was it every other week? I can't remember. But I met with, it was Usha Marcy, and that was so helpful. And just there was a kind of accountability that was happening all the time. We were trying to support each other as we were at different stages of our different projects. And to me, I mean, that we sort of carried that through all the way to the end was really was helpful to me. I hope it was helpful to them as well. And that made a big difference. Yeah, the sense that even though I wasn't physically in the presence of all these other people in the center, I mean, with the weekly presentations, and I definitely felt connected, and so that was helpful. And I will say, at least for me personally, having this project to work on really made the pandemic much easier to cope with because I sort of had something in the future that I was working toward. It gave me structure. It organized my life in a way that made me feel like I was doing something productive, even if I was in my house a lot. Um,
Mhm.
and so that, yeah, I really cherished the project as I was working on it because it was in such strange circumstances.
Well, thank you for sharing the published book with us and allowing us to celebrate it on this occasion. I think our audience and I have really enjoyed hearing you talk about it. And for those that haven't read it, I'm sure they look forward to exploring it in the near future. Um, so thank you, Jim, for joining us, and thanks to everybody who's here with us. I'm going to start wrapping up right now, and let me first say that we always do this with this series. Everyone who registered for today's event was automatically entered into a drawing to receive one of three copies of Literature for the Masses. And so let me tell you who the three recipients are. They are Becky Leggett, Jan Osborne, and Mark Richmond. And we will be in touch with the three of you to get you your copies of Literature for the Masses. And finally, to all of you who have joined us virtually today, I want to say that we have another event in this series coming up this same quarter. On March 11th, Johanna Drucker, Professor Emerita of Information Studies at UCLA, joins us to discuss her absolutely incredible book, Effluvia, The Toxic Off-Gassing of Affluent Culture, another book that has a great deal to say about our current moment. That's March 11th. Details are available on our website, shc.stanford.edu. So for now, let me thank everybody who attended, and especially let me thank Jim, and we look forward to seeing all of you in person and virtually at the Humanities Center. Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Bye bye.